Hi, I'm Molly Boyle. My colleague, Vin Messina, and I are going to explore the list of top finance and accounting priorities. We're going to highlight why these things are top priorities, why they're top of mind and important to CFOs, chief accounting officers, and controllers. We'll discuss what the risks are of not having the time to adequately focus on these areas. And most importantly, we'll highlight how technology like BlackLine's modern accounting platform enable finance and accounting teams to succeed. All right, Vin, so we're here today to talk about finance and accounting priorities. What's at the top of the mind for CFOs, for chief accounting officers, and controllers? And we're going to discuss a variety of different priorities, and we're going to start with talking a little bit about talent. Specifically, we're going to talk about recruiting, retaining, and optimizing talent. So I want to set the stage by why we're here, why we're even talking about this subject, right? I think as finance and accounting leaders, it's easy to focus on the numbers, right? Mm-hmm. To focus on the results, the deliverables that we're responsible for. But at the end of the day, no matter how much technology, how much automation organizations are able to put in place, a lot of what they do is because of the people who are doing it, right? So why are we here talking about talent in your mind in this day and age?
So I think it's multi-pronged, generally speaking, but the first place to start is that as a finance and accounting professional, the value you deliver to your organization is largely dependent upon what you spend your time doing. That's the first thing.
Sure.
But the second piece of this is the research shows that people who are sort of the top talent, people who are really, really good at what they do, they're upwards of 400 to 800% more productive. So you're getting more productivity out of these folks. So then you have to take a step back and figure out, well, how can I get more of those people? How can I retain them? And then how can I get them doing the work that's going to actually help me compete on a global scale better?
Yeah, you're right. And I was just reading a recent article by Accenture, right, just to further highlight why we're discussing talent as a topic. And this article highlighted 4 top disruptors for CFOs in this upcoming year. And one was recruiting and retaining top talent. I think 42% of CFOs said this is a critical disruptor for them if they cannot get their arms around retaining the right people and bringing in the right people to their organization. So let's talk about, the cost of not doing that. What happens if we're not focused as finance and accounting leaders on people?
So I start with the opportunity loss first. So if your people are not doing work that makes you more competitive, you're losing on the back end of whatever work they are doing. So if you're not paying attention to the next merger and acquisition and leveraging the accounting mental model, if you will, you might overpay for a merger and acquisition, right? So you're losing money on the back end of that transaction. The other thing is low productivity for employees that just are not committed or engaged, right? They're just sort of passing the time. They're not really into it, right? So you're losing in regards to your business and profitability just based on lost productivity. But then you got to factor in things like turnover. So, hiring is costly. Losing people is costly. It's both time consuming as well as financial, like dollars consumption, right? You're burning money. So keeping people engaged, you get that productivity that we talk about with regards to top talent, they stay. The question becomes, what happens if they don't? And where do you go? And how do you neutralize that risk, particularly when an unemployment rate is so low? So the fact of the matter is you've got to look at your talent pool. You got to make sure they're producing, right, and not just ticking and tying anymore. They're providing, developing and delivering insights to executives who have to make important decisions. And you want that brain focused on that kind of work. The question becomes, how do you find them? Mm-hmm. How do you entice them to work here? And then how do you get the most out of them? Those are 3 critical components of an effective talent pool.
Well, you make a good point, too, that it's not just about bringing the people in or identifying the right talent. That's certainly one important step, right? But I can recall having done this myself, right, as an assistant controller. I was lucky enough to be able to recruit and bring in some really great people. But if the underlying work that you're able to offer them as a leader, as CFO, as a accounting leader, if that work is manual, if it's repetitive, if it's error prone and risk prone, no matter how well you were able to position a role or how interesting or how quickly your organization is growing, those types of responsibilities are not going to retain the right people. In fact, BlackLine actually did a survey late last year with IDC, And we found 94%, right, of accounting and IT leaders agreed that compliance work, traditional financial close work, gets in the way of other strategic work. And one of the things you said that I think really we have to keep coming back to is, again, how these people are spending their time. And so if the reality for many accounting organizations is that they bring people in or they have people that they want to retain, and the work they're giving those people day in and day out is sort of the way they've always done it, or is not sort of stepping up to the evolving roles that we're seeing in the marketplace right now, there's going to be a downstream cost of that. Whether that downstream cost is errors that present themselves, late surprises, bad business decisions, as you said, there is a high cost of having manual work that's not sustainable.
You have the wrong people doing the wrong work, or you have the right people doing the wrong work, or you have the right people doing the right work. And if the right people are doing the right work, everything sort of happens as it's supposed to happen, and they're committed to the performance. But let's take a look at just one sort of data point that says 81% of respondents said what makes them want to stay working for an organization. They want to contribute. They want to be part of the story.
Sure.
And when you're doing manual accounting work, that doesn't feel like that. It's not performance driven, right? It's sort of old school governance work. So then you have to associate that with the idea of, first of all, the challenge of finding the right people. That's a problem. And then the cost of turnover, losing the right people. And so what's a root cause of that? Workload. What kind of work are they doing?
Right.
So if you're hiring people, you want to show them what kind of work they're going to be doing. If you want to retain people, you got to show them what kind of work they're going to be doing. And then if you want to optimize them, you've got to give them work that contributes to the bottom line.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, I think I, for one, can recall having conversations with valuable, talented staff of mine where the conversation went something like, well, how's it going? What ideas might you have? What do you want to focus on in the upcoming months? And you get a response like, this isn't what I went to school for, right? Or this isn't what I envision myself doing. Or, there's that component to it, but there's also, sort of the burnout component to it, right? And I think in this environment with the Great Resignation, having a risk of burnout, having work that requires significant overtime, that's difficult to predict, that has lots of peaks and valleys, is not only not sustainable from a risk perspective to the bottom line, to the financial results, but it's a risk to, the cost of the finance and accounting organization. You're absolutely right there. It is not fun, certainly, but it's also not cheap to have to bring in new people.
No, and in fact, actually, it's a major burden on the people that are supposed to be providing the most value, which of course is your leadership. So if they're constantly focused on turnover and hiring and the recruiting process, they're not focused on doing what you'd actually like them to do, which is developing those insights. We're both accountants. Mm-hmm. We were taught to think a certain way. I find a lot of value in the way we were taught to think. We are built to interpret things a certain way. You give us some transactions and some history, and we can start to piece together a puzzle that may help you with your next decision. We make sure the data is right, so the financial planning and budgeting people can get their numbers right. So everybody has the right expectation. We can decipher and analyze variances. Like I talked about mergers and acquisitions. We can tell you what you should acquire and what you should pay for it, because that's what we're taught to do. So why would you have them sitting there ticking and tying manual transactions? It doesn't make any sense, particularly when you don't have to. So let's just shift it, but we're not just shifting for the sake of our own performance as an organization. We're shifting for the sake of maintaining high talents, high morale. Because if I can get 800% more productivity out of someone who's really good, I want to make sure they stay.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's shift our conversation to sort of the impact of technology on, enabling this talent optimization, right? I was talking to, a chief accounting officer in my network recently and picking his brain on this topic. And I recall asking him, how roles have evolved and how his role as a leader has evolved over time. And one of the things that he said, right off the bat was, well, what used to be really my entire focus today is now just the price of admission, right? And so I have to be able to find a way to continue to be excellent in everything that I do, but I'm not necessarily getting more people to do it with. So technology becomes a critical enabler of optimizing how my people spend their time. And I think in addition to just that, there's an important employee experience component of this as well. As we are living in this era of the Great Resignation and of roles evolving in finance and accounting, we have reached this inflection point where incorporating technology and giving our valuable people the platform and the tools to optimize their time is of critical importance.
Molly, that's an excellent point. I got one for you. I was talking to a controller recently about recruiting the younger generation, call them millennials, Generation Z, whatever the next generation is. And she looked at me, she said, why are you asking me that question? I said, well, there's a reason. I want to get to it. And I said, are you having a problem? And she said, well, interestingly enough, yes. Somebody just started and left in 48 hours. And I said, why? She said, well, because our processes are outdated. And she didn't really want to do this kind of work. So I spent all that time recruiting her. It took her 2 days to leave because they don't want to do this work, right? Sure. And so the question becomes, how do we neutralize that? Where does technology fit?
Yep.
And it's a really important consideration because we as accountants are typically in charge of governance, control, compliance, reports, all this other stuff. There was a movement that started, maybe 6-7 years ago. It basically said, no, we're going to move to guidance. And a lot of the things that we're talking about with regards to taking advantage of the mind of an accountant is because you want to do things like pricing strategies and whatnot. You want to do things like mergers and acquisitions. But if you don't transition, the work for compliance is still important. You can't not do it.
Right.
What you have to do is take advantage of what you said, and that is technology that puts some of that on autopilot, cleans it up a little bit, so then the mind can go move in different directions. So you're still covering the risk and the process. You still get all that done. You're in compliance. But people aren't killing themselves. And there's a great story here. I was at a conference for mostly controllers, recorded a report for life sciences. And there was a controller on stage, and he actually started recruiting. I was cracking up laughing. I'm like, what's going on here? He said, I normally don't do that. And then people are like, what are you doing? He says, well, I don't have anybody on my team that can do valuation. Now think that through for a minute.
Yeah.
Yes, he does. They're busy. So he's recruiting externally, taking advantage of all the risk of external recruiting. But you know he has people on his team that can do valuation. That's what we're basically trained to do, right? They can't because they're busy. So what's his answer? Find somebody in the audience? No. Buy some technology that puts some of this stuff on autopilot because he has the talent right underneath him.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting point. And you reminded me of another component of my conversation with the CAO I mentioned earlier, which is I asked him what else has sort of fundamentally changed in terms of how he can successfully do his job. And the other thing he said is, I hire differently now, right? And so you mentioned sort of skill sets, right? It'd be great if we could all use our analytical skills, if we could advise the business. But to your point, if we don't have the platform and the tools to give us the opportunity to do that, then we don't get the luxury of doing so. Because to your point, the compliance related work is not optional. It's
not optional.
As he said, it's now just the price of admission. But if our processes aren't lending us to have our popcorn and candy along with our price of admission, we're missing the boat. And so, continuing this conversation with the CAO that I was speaking with, he mentioned that 10 years ago, when he looked at a resume for an ideal candidate, he was looking for the things that you and I would probably think about, right? He was looking to, do they have their CPA, right? Do they have some sort of Big Four public accounting experience? Do they have some sort of broad perspective? What does their training look like? What does their degree look like? And it's not to say that those things are not important or not relevant anymore. But now, to bring this back to technology and the role that Blackline can play in sort of enabling this recruiting and retaining of top talent, organizations and leaders are looking for employees who know how to use technology, right? Who understand how to constantly challenge the status quo, how to spend their time not looking for a needle in a haystack, not with their colored pencils, their binders, and all those things that I used to love at the beginning of my career, but rather, leveraging the talent, or leveraging rather the technology platforms, the automation that's available to them so that they can use those data skills so that they can bring insights to the organization.
So I don't know how many years ago the world moved to this notion of data, big data, data analytics. So someone asked me once, what does Blackline do in terms of data analytics? They go, well, we have some built into the engine. I said, but what do you mean? Well, it's a priority of ours. I said, all right, I'll tell you our relationship. Someone's got to analyze all that data. What are they doing right now? You got all this data because we're in a data-rich world. I mean, the more, every year that goes by, more and more layers of data. Well, someone has to make sense of that. That's literally what we do for a living. Yeah, it used to be that we booked transactions and we did accounting. But now what we're supposed to be doing is making sense of the world. And so you have all this data. What kind of people do you have making sense of it? Well, that's what we should be doing, right? That's what we should be helping you do. I was talking to a CAO, walking him through this progression on capacity. And he paused for a moment. He goes, yeah, just met me. He says, yeah, I'm about to talk to my CFO right now. I said, about what? And it was something you said, doing more with less. He says, every time I go in to have a conversation with him, he's telling me I got to cut staff and do more. How do you do that? Now, there's a reason for that. You want cost control, right? You don't want an inflated payroll deck, but you still got to get all this work done. So how do you marry all that? And it's not just about automation either. It's about centralizing where all this information is so people aren't wasting their time chasing stuff down.
Yep.
Because what I'm trying to tell people in the modern day, accountants, you and I go, you worked at Under Armour. We don't go and do work that is bookkeeping. Or we don't do bookkeeping. We gather and validate information. And the bigger you are, the more silos you have, that means your accountant is going to chase down all this information. We have to make sure it's correct. Why don't we just put this layer that centralizes all that information so that we're spending less time roaming the halls chasing it down? Because that's not even accounting. That's just chasing something down. Well, what's the value in that? You have the compliance. So to your point, it's mandatory. But can you just put that on autopilot? Put it in one place so everybody can see it. Neutralize emails and meetings. That's what we want to be doing.
Right.
Because that's not even accounting work.
Right. So I think to put a bow sort of on this topic of, talent, I think we clearly articulated or clearly explored why this is a top priority, why CFOs are focused on recruiting, retaining, and optimizing their talent. But bringing this all back to our platform, to what Blackline is doing for organizations, I can't tell you enough how, in my firsthand experience, not just bringing in a platform like Blackline changed the lives of the people that were working for me, but how it gave them opportunities, right, that they wouldn't have otherwise had, and therefore gave the company value, right, that we wouldn't have otherwise had, not just in our ability to absorb more revenue volume, absorb acquisitions, new entities, new data sources, but in giving us our time back, right? Just to close the loop of one of the points you made at the beginning of our conversation, which is that the value of your people ultimately is how they spend their time, right? And so what Blackline is enabling for our customers is liberating them from the time spent on repetitive manual work, the time spent on finding data from all of those different sources that are only growing as companies increase in complexity and develop new business models. It's giving them the platform to use their own capabilities, their own talents in the most optimized way to ultimately deliver value back to the organization.
I have a very simple formula, as you're well aware of. I walk into an accounting executive and I say, hey, Molly, are there things you want to do that you can't get to? The answer is universally yes. Big impact of not doing that stuff? The answer is typically yes. I said, what if we could find you some time? That's Blackline's, that's what we're delivering. Do we neutralize risk in the process? Yes. Do we do a whole bunch of other things in the process? Yes. But if it's fundamental core, we are delivering time so that you can do more things with that time. And so it's actually a basic element of neutralizing busy work so that people can focus on strategic work. That's it.
That's right. Thanks, Ben.